Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to the International Methods Colloquium. The International Methods Colloquium, or IMC, is a periodic online interactive seminar discussion on the application of quantitative statistical methodology to the social sciences, sponsored by Wake Forest University and previously sponsored by Rice University and the National Science Foundation. I'm Justin Essery, an associate professor here at Wake Forest. This week's speaker is Masha Krupenkin of Stanford University, giving a talk entitled The Advantages and Limitations of Using Individual-Level Web Search Data to Study Political Behavior. And I was asked to mention that Masha is on the job market right now, so I hope you'll pay special interest to this talk. Masha's talk will last about 30 to 40 minutes, after which point we will take questions from the audience. You can ask a question using the Zoom Q&A button that appears at the bottom of the webinar window. And you can ask a question anytime during the talk, but all the questions, unless they're just very purely clarification questions, will be held until the end of the presentation. A link to Masha's slideshow will be available in the Zoom webinar chat window so that you may refer to it throughout the presentation. I'll provide that link right after we get started. And now I'd like to welcome Masha Krupenkin to the IMC. Welcome.
Hi, thank you, Justin. So thank you guys for coming to my talk. The advantages and limitations of using individual-level web search data to study political behavior. Let's get started. So I don't think I have to convince anybody that search engines are popular. There are about 70,000 Google searches per second, and that ends up yielding 1.2 trillion Google searches per year worldwide. So that's a lot of data. And the purpose of my talk today is going to be to discuss how we can harness some of this sort of powerful data in order to study political science. So my talk is going to be in 4 portions. So first, I'll talk about why search data is such a great data source and talk about some of the advantages, some of the limitations. Then I'm going to talk about how I use and validate Bing search data in my work. So do want to be upfront about this. This is not publicly available data, but collaborations and whatnot are available, and that's how political scientists gain access to this data. And then I'm going to present sort of summaries of 2 papers that I've done that really touch on why search data is such a powerful methodological tool. So the first will look at search data as a solution to survey response bias, and the second will show, demonstrate how we can use search data to solve a tricky causal inference problem. Alrighty, so part 1, why use search data? So when I'm going to be talking about the benefits and limitations of search data, I'm going to be comparing them to one of the most popular data sources in political behavior, which is survey data. And I really like surveys. I use them a lot in my own research. I use them a lot in conjunction with search data, but they do have certain drawbacks that search data can alleviate. So first, surveys have a very well-known and serious potential for non-attitudes. So I'm a pollster, I call you up, you're average Joe, and I say, hey, you, average Joe, what do you think about the economy? And, maybe you don't sit around thinking about the economy every day. Maybe you just go to work, you go home, spend time with your family, but yet here I am on the phone pressing you to give me an answer. What do you think about the economy right now? And so, you give me an answer, you satisfy me, but that answer doesn't have anything to do with your real beliefs. It's just an answer you gave me to go away. And, and I go merrily on my way, not knowing that this answer doesn't actually have anything to do with any real world beliefs that you may have. Search data elides this problem completely because searching is motivated behavior. So, if I type in Zillow or I type in register to vote into, my web browser, that sort of means that I have this intrinsic motivation to look up this information, and that it does say something about my revealed preferences. Second, survey data has this very strong social desirability bias and these social desirability issues. So, it's very difficult to ask people questions about racism, questions about mental health, criminal activity, just a whole wide variety of topics that may be of interest to political scientists, but are sort of sensitive. And once again, search data avoids this because people are searching in the privacy of their own home. They're not really thinking about what researchers are, whether or not people are seeing their answers. So this avoids this sort of social desirability issue. A third sort of common issue with survey data is that they generally have a fairly small sample size. It's about an N of about 1,000 for your average survey. And really increasing that N becomes very expensive very quickly. Whereas with search data, you have millions of users at your fingertips. And this is actually important for more than just questions of power and effect sizes. This is important because there are many behaviors that we really do care about, for example, political donation, that are really important, but also sufficiently rare that it's actually fairly difficult to get a good grasp on them using survey data. Fourth, and this is actually a point that I'm going to return to later in the talk as sort of important point, survey data is temporally static. So maybe I might have a couple waves, but if I'm lucky, but usually it's sort of at this one date or one set of dates. And it's really difficult to sort of measure events, the effect of particular events, unless it's already a fairly well-known question, a fairly well-established series of series of surveys. With search data, we have this high temporal granularity. So what that means is that if I wanted to compare what people were searching for on 1 p.m. March 1st, 2016, I can compare it with what they were searching for at 1 p.m. March 1st of 2017. And I can even go further. I can look at it to the seconds, which is fairly useful for studying events and things like that. And then a fifth sort of point, and sort of compounding all of these four prior issues, is that for surveys, the connection to behavior can be a bit shaky sometimes. And sometimes a very good example of this is sort of people's reporting of their turnout. So we know that people over-report turnout, and we also know that some people are more likely to over-report turnout than others. And so this is actually a fairly serious issue. Whereas with search data, there's actually been quite a bit of work that shows that there's this well-documented connection to behavior. And that's actually my next slide, which is that search data has been shown to predict a wide variety of behaviors. So it actually predicts consumption behavior and purchasing behavior quite well. One of these papers that I cite actually compares Google Trends data on sort of consumption, on sort of searches for consumer goods with the Consumer Confidence Index. And Google Trends actually pretty dramatically outperforms the Consumer Confidence Index as a predictor of actual consumption. It predicts health effects, so drug adverse effects, cancer, suicide, a lot of these various sort of things that we care about. As political scientists, we especially care about political effects, and search data does predict these real-world political behaviors like voter registration and voter turnout. And then, just miscellaneous, there are other behaviors, just tourism and unemployment, that search data does a good job of predicting. So now I hope I've convinced you that search data has quite a few advantages over traditional methodologies that are used to study political behavior. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about the limitations of search data as compared to survey data. I want to be on level and really be upfront about some of these limitations as well. So survey data is nationally representative. Usually that's, sort of a goal. And obviously there are some issues with response rates, but generally speaking, we really try to make sure that it is representative of the people who live in our target population. Whereas with search, especially Bing search, which is what I use, one does have this fairly significant non-representativeness issue. So Bing searchers do tend to be whiter, older, and maler than the population of the United States. But even Google searchers are not, a perfect representation of everybody who lives in the United States or, abroad. And there are definitely ways to get around this. The thing that I focus on is I usually look at a specific population over time. So, I look at the effect of a particular event, but there are also weighting and MRP methods to really help fix some of this non-representativeness issues. A second sort of limitation of search data as compared to survey data is that survey data is fairly long-lived. if I do a survey today, it'll be available. The data will still be available, usually 10 years from now or whatever. Whereas with search data, due to privacy concerns, oftentimes search data is scrubbed or deleted after 18 to 54 months, depending on the particular type of data. So there are certainly ways to sort of mitigate this, but most of the time it's, I can't, for example, go back and look at the 2012 election. A third sort of point is that for surveys, you do have survey experiments are fairly widely used and well known. I don't think it's possible to really do that kind of extensive experimentation using search data, especially not the part of search data that I'm interested in, which is what people are actually typing into the search bar, as opposed to maybe the results they're clicking on. And then finally, I think this is a limitation of both. There have been some high-profile failures for both survey data and search data. So in 1936, the Literary Digest poll, this was a magazine that had predicted a bunch of previous presidential elections correctly, and it predicted that FDR was going to lose by a landslide. And obviously, FDR did not lose by a landslide in 1936. So that was sort of a very high-profile failure of survey methodology at the time. And similarly, Google Flu Trends was sort of really touted as an example of the power of big data when it first came out, and that it ran into some fairly serious issues. And I'm going to talk a little bit about Google Flu Trends right now and sort of what we can learn from that experience. So Google Flu Trends was an attempt to predict flu incidence from search terms. So basically, what they did was they had sort of CDC data for flu-related doctor's visits. And what they did was they built a model that looked at 50 million common search terms and looked at which ones predicted the doctor's visits the best. And I think they picked, in the end, they had 45 terms in their final model. And the early results from this data were fairly promising, but there were serious issues starting in 2011. So what can we learn from Google Flu Trends? And sort of how can we use this to improve this sort of search data methodology? So the first and most important point is that user interaction with technologies, such as search engines, definitely changes over time. So people who were using Google in 2003 were quite different from people who were using Google in 2013, and they were using Google in different ways. So basically, for example, in 2003, as far as I know, there was no auto-suggest feature, and that's something that really does influence the way in which people search. And so that's something that, is really important to keep in mind. So this idea that users use technologies differently as time goes on, and we really need to be cognizant of what people are using search engines for if we want to work with search data. Second sort of point is that careful validation is extremely important when it comes to working with these sorts of newer data sources. So there was sort of concern with the Google Flu Trends that what was happening was in reality, it was predicting sort of the keywords they were looking at were predicting things like winter and things like that. So individual level validation is very important when working with search data. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that when I talk about how I use search data in my work. But then sort of on an optimistic note, models can be improved. There was a team that was able to sort of alleviate some of these issues with Google Flu Trends. They published a paper in 2015. And as far as I know, their prediction model is still working quite well. So I think when in the future we talk about search data and search data for social science, we will look at Google Flu Trends the same way that survey researchers look at the 1936 Literary Digest poll. All right. So now moving on to the second portion of my talk, where I talk sort of about some of the methodologies that I use in working with search data. So I'm going to address a question that I get quite a bit when I am giving any sort of talk or presentation using this data, which is, who uses Bing? The answer is quite a few people use Bing, actually. It has 33% of market share in the United States. So that's actually quite a lot. And it's the second largest search engine in the United States. And one of the really useful things about Bing data and about having this data at the individual level, so I have an ID number and I can see what that particular ID searched over a period of time, is that I can link it to individual level covariates. And the way that I do that is by using a survey on the MSN.com front page or the MSN.com news politics page. So here's an example of one of these survey questions that tends to be important in my work because I study partisan identification. So, which party do you most closely identify with? And this is a poll. It's on the page. It's entirely opt-in. So people do sort of answer this question, and I have their ID, and I can say, okay, so this ID is a Republican or this ID is a Democrat, and we know that they searched these things over the course of these past 18 months. And I can also do this with additional covariates like age and gender and education. So in addition to just other sort of substantive survey questions. So the sky's very much the limit when it comes to the kind of things that I can link to people's search. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about validating search data. And I briefly touched on this when I was talking about Google Flu trends, but validating search data is incredibly important because let's say I want to see, let's say I have a search term in mind. Let's say I'm interested in seeing how people were searching for something like, Zillow. And what I really want to do is I really want to make sure that this has some sort of connection to real world behavior. So it could be, the people are searching for Zillow because they're interested in buying a house, they're thinking about buying a house, they're thinking about moving. Or it could be that they're just, interested in ogling housing prices in the area. I mean, I live in Palo Alto. That's a popular pastime. So what's really important is sort of making sure that this search data has some real world significance. And there are three kind of ways that I do that. And I'm going to talk about each of them in a couple of slides. The first way is through demographics. The second is through seasonality. And the third is through survey responses. And I'm going to touch briefly on each of these three. So validating with demographics. That is sort of using established relationships between variables of interest and age, gender, or ethnicity to link search and real world behavior. And to sort of illustrate what this means, I'm just going to show you an example. So we know that women are significantly more likely to be diagnosed with anxiety and depression than are men. And so the idea is that if people are, searching for anxiety or depression, that has some sort of correlation with whether or not they are suffering from these conditions in real life. So if searching for depression is actually correlated with an incidence of depression, we should see that women search significantly more than men for this particular term. And this is, just on the graph, this is exactly what we see. We see that women search actually about twice as much as men for both anxiety and depression. And so sort of the y-axis here is the percentage of searchers who have searched a term on a particular time period. And And another sort of similar thought process I was looking to validate some terms that I was interested in, knowing whether or not they correlated with voter turnout. And we know that there is a strong relationship between age and voter turnout. We know that younger people are significantly less likely to vote than older people. And so what I did was I took the terms that I was interested in looking at, and I looked at sort of among the people who we knew were 18 to 29-year-olds. I looked at this and, I compared them with people who were older on in 2016. And so what we see here is that younger people in my data set are less likely to search for these voting related terms, and searches for these voting related terms really peak on election day. So that's a good indicator that this particular term is actually related somehow to turnout. All right. So moving on to the second method of validation, which is validating with seasonality. So here, sort of a similar concept. We use established relationships between variables of interest and time to link search and real-world behavior. So what this sort of looks like is there are a lot of sort of behaviors in the real world that are strongly sort of correlated with the seasons. So one example is housing purchases. So there is a hot season for the housing market and a colder season for the housing market. And generally speaking, we see the largest number of housing purchases in the summer months. And I was looking to validate a set of search terms that I, was thinking had a relationship to housing purchases. So the seasonality on this graph, it follows a very similar pattern to the way in which housing purchases happen in the real world, which is that there is a hot season, from April to about July, August, and then there's a big drop off toward the end of the year. And similarly, with searches for depression, there is also a well-known similar sort of seasonality effect where we see a significant dip during the summer months in people's diagnoses with depression. It's warmer out, it's lighter out. So there are fewer people who are diagnosed with this particular illness, and we also see a bit of a dip around the holidays as well, just because people are with family, all that sort of good stuff. And so the pattern of searches over the year has a sort of a well-known, has a very similar pattern to this well-known empirical regularity about depression diagnoses. Finally, the third method of validating search data is validating with survey data. So explicitly asking survey respondents the question of interest and observing their searches. So just as a reminder, this is how we ask sort of survey questions, how we ask questions of our searchers. And an example question for validating something like car purchases, say, I had a bunch of terms that I assumed were correlated, or that I thought were correlated with car purchases. So asking people, is now a good time or a bad time to buy a car? And then looking at the searches for the people who said that it was a good time to buy a car and comparing it to the searches for the people who said it was a bad time to buy a car. And what we see here is sort of the blue line is people who think it's a good time to buy a car, and sort of the percentage of those people per day who searched for these car-related terms. And the red line is, people who think it's a bad time to buy a car. And one of the important things to think about when doing this kind of survey validation is that it's important to make sure that your survey question is not influencing people's results. So what I actually did was I asked this survey question in November of 2017, but these searches are from January to July of 2017. And so basically, the question was asked afterwards, and I wanted to see if people who thought, it was a good time were going to be more likely to be searching. and similar sort of survey question with, is now a good or bad time to buy a house? So now that I've talked about search data and why search data is valuable, and I've talked a little bit about the particular methodologies that I use when working with search data, I'm going to present two studies that really, I think, highlights the value of search data as a tool for social scientists. So the first study is looking at search data as a solution to survey response bias. So, and so the framing of the study, immediately after Trump was elected, there was this flood of stories, these news stories about Donald Trump and sort of the mental health of the American population. So this is just literally the first three search results that I got for uh, Trump and depression. In the divided U.S., therapists are treating anxiety or hearing the same name over and over again. Post-election stress disorder. What's Trump doing in your therapy room? There's really a small mountain of studies, or a small mountain of, these news articles that really posit again and again that Donald Trump had kind of this effect on the American population and on Democrats especially. So here's a sort of example of very colorful anecdote coming from Dana Milbank with the from an op-ed with the title "President Trump is actually making us crazy." From the left came a flood of responses. People experiencing all manner of symptoms, real or imagined. Disturbed sleep, anger, depression, headaches, high blood sugar. So just quite a bit of colorful anecdata. And this seems like quite a bit. It seems like a lot, and there is a little bit of survey support for the idea that Trump did cause some mental health issues among Democrats. What we see here, some Gallup results. They ask a question, a series. It's a series of surveys that ask, did you experience the following feelings during a lot of the day yesterday? How about worry? What we see here is that after the 2008 election, Republicans didn't really have, none of the three categories of partisans had a particularly large increase in worry. Whereas after the 2016 election, you see this really massive increase for Democrats. You have nearly 10 percentage points going from, basically 30 to 40% of Democrats who said that they experienced worry during a lot of the day yesterday. So this is all very colorful, but none of this, none of this evidence is conclusive one way or the other. So the question that I kind of was interested in was, did Trump's election actually cause a mental health crisis among Democrats? And this is actually a fairly interesting and important question, because we as political scientists have a lot of theories about partisan identification and the role that partisan identification plays in our everyday lives. The idea that party ID could actually cause Democrats, to have significant mental distress after Donald Trump is elected is, a very strong claim to make about the nature of party ID and the role that it plays in people's lives. So the issue with studying mental health using surveys is that there are actually some very serious social desirability issues. So the first issue is that mental health is a stigmatized topic. People may be less likely to admit on a survey that, they are worried or that they have depression. But interestingly enough, in this particular case, the converse may also be true. There is this potential for expressive reporting or virtue signaling. So, maybe if you were a Democrat and you ran in particular circles after the 2016 election, you were concerned that if you weren't, gnashing your teeth and pulling your hair out enough, you were seen as not insufficiently sort of committed to opposing Trump, or, this desire to sort of signal that you were really, really against Trump's proposed policies. So saying, oh yes, Trump's election makes me depressed because I look at sort of the future of America and that makes me depressed. So this is actually an interesting question from a survey perspective, because we have social desirability effects that could really go in either way here. So the research approach that I took was I looked at searches for depression, anxiety, stress, suicide therapy, and a whole variety of antidepressant drugs and anti-anxiety drugs before and after the 2016 election. And you guys have seen some of my validations already for the depression and the anxiety searches. So these do correlate with sort of these real world phenomena. And I looked at Republican versus Democrats. So we had about 30,000 searchers for whom we knew sort of their party ID or their vote in 2016. And in addition to looking at the partisanship dimension, I also looked at the ethnicity dimension. So I looked at Spanish-speaking searchers who lived in the US versus English-only searchers who lived in the US. And in total, I had about 1 million searchers for these. I obviously did not take every single English-speaking searcher, English-only searcher in the US. I randomly sampled them. And the way that I identified Spanish-speaking searchers was I took all of the IDs that had used Spanish Bang in the United States at least once. And just in total, I limited my sample to people who used Bing before and after the election, just to make sure that I was not sort of, for example, capturing the effect of an influx of a particular kind of searcher or, an exit of a particular kind of searcher before or after the election. All right, so the results. Results showed that there was actually a pretty significant rise in mental health searches among our sort of Latino searchers for anxiety, depression, drugs, and therapy. There wasn't really much of an increase in the term stress. And the term suicide, unfortunately, was confounded with the movie Suicide Squad that was released in August. So we can't really tell what the effect on that particular term was, but 4 out of 6 yielded these fairly strong and statistically significant effects. And we really didn't have any such effects for English-only searchers. So I don't have the regression for this in the slides, but basically, what I did was I interacted sort of Spanish with, post-election, and basically there was no significance on the English-only searchers, but there was a significance on sort of the Spanish times post-election variable. And in addition to sort of English-only searchers not having an effect, Democrats also, the Democrats in our sample also did not have any sort of significant increase in searches for these mental health-related terms. So the lines between the Democrats and the Republicans are basically parallel here. And so, and given sort of the very clean validation that I got on these terms for things like gender and things like seasonality, I'm inclined to say that this does represent, this is a null result that does not represent a lack of power. That this is a null result that does seem to correspond to a null effect. So just as kind of a takeaway from this particular study, the Trump election was associated with a large rise in mental health-related searches among Latinos, and there was no sort of similar response among Republicans, Democrats, or English-only searchers in general. And all of this does suggest that there might be some social desirability bias among Democrats. Unfortunately, I was not able to find a survey that was asking Democrats before and after the election whether or not they were depressed. But it could be that all of these sort of news articles were picking up on maybe people sort of virtue signaling or people just expressively reporting. So that's study 1, and that kind of really shows the power of this search data to solve these questions of social desirability bias. So moving on to study number 2. This is the fourth and final portion of my talk, which is using search data for causal inference. And this is a paper that's not yet in circulation, and so I'm going to be focusing on sort of a portion of this paper that's most related to this causal inference question. So there's been quite a bit of literature asking this particular question. Do negative ads increase voter engagement? It's a highly debated question in political science. This particular review I cite finds that there's compelling evidence on both sides. It could be that negative ads increase turnout. It could be that negative ads decrease turnout by increasing cynicism. So there's been quite a bit of research done on this particular topic. And a lot of this research, while really fantastic and insightful and useful, has some fairly serious causal inference challenges. And there's this very serious internal validity issue for observational studies that are basically done in the field, where you look at voter turnout in races that have larger numbers of negative ads. And sort of the issue there is that more negative races also tend to be more competitive, and more competitive races also tend to have higher turnout. So we don't know if negativity of the negative ads are causing higher turnout, or if the competitiveness is causing higher turnout, or if neither of those is causing higher turnout. And there are some external validity issues when we talk about lab experiments. So lab experiments have this really great internal validity when it comes to the causal inference. You show people a video and then you ask them, how likely are you to vote in the midterm elections? But again, the problem with how likely are you to vote in the midterm elections is that doesn't necessarily correlate very well with how likely people are to actually vote. This is just an answer they give on a survey in a lab. So the approach that I used was I wanted to leverage the temporal granularity to study the causal effect of campaign ads. So basically what I would be doing was I would be looking at searches before and after a campaign ad ran. So that way we have this really great causal inference strategy. You look 2 minutes before and 2 minutes after, but at the same time, it's in the real world. It's in the field. So this particular searches that I looked at were searches for candidates and searches for voter registration, because I wanted to look at information seeking behavior, so sort of political engagement, as well as, actual behavior, that is related, that is a step you need to take in order to vote. And we see that voter registration searches are actually quite correlated with actual voter registration in the real world. So I had about 4,000 national ads, national presidential campaign ads in 2016 that were at least 2 minutes away from another presidential ad and also above the ad spend threshold. So ad spend is a variable that is very standard to use in these sort of ad studies, and that is a measure of ad audience. So if an ad reaches more people, it costs more. And sort of just keeping that in mind, I weighted the ads by ad spend. So an ad that was running, during prime time on a popular channel was going to be weighted more than an ad that was running on, at 2 a.m. on a channel nobody really watches. And I coded the ads as positive or negative based on sort of the buyer and the target. So if there's an ad about Clinton from the Trump campaign, that's a negative ad. Unfortunately, I did not have the scripts for any of these ads, so I really had to rely on the buyer and the target in order to really use this data. So the results. So here we have a graph plot of these 4 different types of ads and the searches that occurred after in the 2 minutes before and the 2 minutes after the ads were run. So what we see here is that there is this fairly clean bump in searches for 3 of these categories. These anti-Clinton ads, these pro-Clinton ads, and these pro-Trump ads. And the y-axis is the number of searches weighted by the ad spend of the particular ad. So we do see this sort of clean bump there. And sort of similarly, we see a similar, maybe a weaker effect on voter registration. There is definitely an increase in these searches, but it's not quite as clean and not quite as big as the increase in just searches for the candidates. And just in some sort of results bearing on this positive versus negative question, what we see here, the important sort of lines, the bolded ones. So what we see here is the interaction between post-ad and ad spend. So basically the time period after an ad has run, so from minute 0 to minute 2, that is significant for both the candidate searches and the registration searches. So, people are more likely to search for candidates and registration after an ad that has had a high audience, a large audience. But we see this three-way interaction of post-ad times negative ad times ad spend is not significant. So there is no difference in the way that people search for candidates or registration after a positive ad versus after a negative ad. So the suggestion there from this data is that is that negative ads and positive ads actually have a fairly similar effect on people's levels of engagement. Neither, negative ads do not demobilize, but they also aren't, they also don't mobilize more than positive ads. It's just, the existence of this ad and the sort of reminder of the existence of the campaign. And sort of the purpose that this ad serves. So sort of in conclusion, political ads increase sort of both information-seeking behavior about candidates and also searches for voter registration. And positive and negative ads have similar effects, at least from sort of this regression analysis. And this is sort of a really great example of the way in which search data can be used to solve a pre-existing causal inference problem, where there is this, this serious issue of, where there's this trade-off of internal validity versus external validity in a lot of the prior studies, and we can avoid this trade-off by using this highly granular data source in that is a real-world behavior. So just some final thoughts on the use of search data. Search data can solve these sort of common problems with survey research. And, I've touched on some of them, these non-attitudes, this social desirability bias. There are actually a really wide variety of applications of search data. You have political participation, things like registration, things like turnout, perceptions of the economy. So, whether or not they're searching for durable goods or not, cars, houses, online news consumption, emotional responses to news. So sort of this mental health study, racist attitudes, advertising effects. The sky's very much the limit here because people use search for a whole wide variety of topics. And just, finally, search data does have these sort of useful properties for causal inference as well, in addition to these other useful questions about surveys. All right, so that's actually it for me. I'd like to open it up to Q&A.
Okay. Thank you very much, Masha, for that presentation. At this point, Masha Krupenkin is available to take questions from the audience. You can ask a question using the Zoom Q&A button that appears at the bottom of your webinar window. And in fact, we already have a couple of questions that accumulated during the talk, so I'll just go ahead and start asking them. First, from Jessica Jones, how do we think about effect size here, especially with such a large N? Before and after comparison is useful, but is the jump any larger than seasonal fluctuations?
So my guess is this is a question about the mental health paper?
Yes, I think so.
Mm-hmm. So that's actually a great question. I have not compared the mental health searches in their seasonality as compared to the seasonality. That's actually something I should definitely do. But, we can really, I think it's actually pretty, a significant jump, and it is larger than the seasonal fluctuations because the English-only searcher should be experiencing these same seasonal fluctuations. But when I run this in a regression, this being a Spanish-speaking searcher is associated with sort of a much larger increase in searches for depression and anxiety and therapy and antidepressant medications than is being an English-speaking searcher. So unless we have a hypothesis about seasonality effects being stronger for Spanish-speaking searchers, I think it's actually fairly safe to say that this is a real effect that's based on this particular event rather than just on seasonality.
I have a sort of a follow-up question for that. Obviously, I don't think many people claimed that they were sitting somewhere at election night and then, Trump was announced and like, oh, I'm crazy, right? Like, oh, now I have anxiety disorder, right? That doesn't make sense as a causal process. It's probably something more like, the additional cumulative strain of whatever it is that's going on during the Trump presidency that may or may not make you crazy, wears on you. And so there's sort of, you could think of this as a sort of a dynamic process, right? Where you're going from one equilibrium to another equilibrium and there's a transition and we're not exactly sure how long that's going to take. So how do you model that? I mean, one thing that wasn't in your talk very much was like the actual modeling that was going on behind the scenes. How do you model that?
Those are sort of two separate questions. I'll address a simpler one first,
Yep.
which is, when I model this using regression analysis, the way that I do this is I treat search as a binary variable. So, if a particular person searched for depression on a particular day, that's treated as a 1 for, searches for depression. If they didn't, it's treated as a 0, and the standard errors are clustered by the user. By the user ID. So that's the simple answer to the question of how I model my particular results. The more complicated answer, and I'm not entirely sure that I would necessarily agree that there was no that an instantaneous effect would be unreasonable. If you look at Twitter on election night and on the day after the election, you saw quite a bit of people expressing anguish about the Trump election. And, maybe some of these people were people who had pre-existing mental health conditions that were really exacerbated by the Trump election. I certainly saw quite a few opinion pieces on that. So I think there is a plausible story we can tell where we say that, immediately after the Trump election, people were, had flare-ups of these particular mental health conditions. But I think the sort of question that you pose, the sort of model that you propose, is a better model for, and a more realistic model, because that's something that we see with the Latino searches, right? So it's a very gradual increase over the first few months of the after the election and of the Trump administration for the Spanish-speaking Latinos who maybe they maybe they're close to people who are undocumented, maybe they're undocumented themselves, maybe they're worried about their communities, and so there is this sort of realization process when they realize that that the Trump sort of intense anti-immigrant rhetoric was not just a rhetorical tool, but a genuine expression of of their policy agenda.
That's a really good point. I mean, it's only after a year, however long it's been. What year is it? Like has it been 1,000 years? I don't know. However long is since 2016. The real sort of what Trump is going to be like as president wasn't really that clear once he got elected, and only now is it starting to become somewhat clear. And it's actually not even 100%. I'd say just personally, I think that process is still evolving. In other words, his presidency is continuing to change in some ways.
Yeah, but in terms of the immigration enforcement, there was actually a very quick response.
That's true.
And what we see actually is I've looked a little bit at searches for things like immigration lawyer, and there is actually a pretty dramatic spike, and it's dramatic enough that we actually see it on Google Trends. We don't actually even have to filter it out by Spanish speaking versus English speaking. There is this really dramatic spike, dramatic rise in searches for these immigration related terms after Trump is elected.
I want to go to another question from the audience. So Thomas Ball asks, how would you evaluate the relative importance or magnitude of the three-way interaction between post times negative times ad spend? And obviously, this is for the second question you were asking.
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, it's not a particularly significant effect, but it's not a significant effect at all. But there is the concern that it is, that it is a three-way interaction. And when we look at the actual graphs, let me see. Let me see if I can move back. For some reason, there we go. If we look at the actual graphs, we see that when it comes to the effect, it does seem to be somewhat similar. And the ad spend variable makes it a bit difficult to measure some of these effect sizes because different ads were run at different times and with different ad spend. But for example, on the pro-Clinton ads and the anti-Clinton ads here, we see that the bump is about similar in size. So I do buy the arguments that or the claim that I make that positive and negative ads do have a similar effect on these searches.
I mean, one thing that you might want to think about here is just looking the statistical significance of the interaction term is a reliable indicator of something. But if you're looking at sort of if the key variable of interest here is change in searches, you may want to explicitly look at those marginal effects and compare them, because there can be some weird situations.
Oh yeah, I have done that. I've done some robustness checks to make sure it's being just driven by like one ad, and it really isn't.
Although the other countervailing principle there is the more interactions you add, the more multiple comparisons you're making, and the higher probability you just get a result that's due to statistical noise. And so once you downweight for that, it's really hard. I know your data set's pretty huge, but it's hard to get.
Well, I mean, I'm clustering by ad, right? Because the errors are going to be correlated by the particular ad that is being run. So.
Well, in that case, that would make the downweighting even more impactful. Thomas asked another question. Here's an annualized trend in economic consumer confidence by political party. He links to it. Obviously, I don't know. I guess I could share it via chat. But the chart shows a sharp divergence in confidence by party associated with presidential incumbency. It's the 2017 partisan gap in economic confidence, one of the largest. So I will pass that on to you, but I assume
that's actually related to my job market paper.
Okay. Yeah.
I'm sorry. I'll let you finish the question.
No, there was a link, and that's it.
Yeah. So my job market paper, and I've shown some of the validation things that I do as some of the things that I do there as an example of these validations. But the question that I'm looking at there is sort of this question of motivated reasoning versus partisan cheerleading when the presidency switches parties, right? So we know from Gallup, it's a very well-known result that on surveys immediately after, literally the day after the presidency switches parties, we see this like dramatic shift in partisans' economic expectations. And there's actually a fairly robust literature and a robust debate within political science about whether or not these effects are an indication of partisans' real beliefs, or if partisans are just, expressively reporting. If they're saying, I know my results are going to be aggregated into this survey, and, they're going to say Republicans think this, or, such and such percentage of Americans think the economy is going well under President Trump. So I'm going to say the economy is going well. And so sort of that's the question that I'm looking at. And what I do is I look at searches for cars, houses, and the stock market among Democrats and Republicans before and after the 2016 election. And basically what I find is that Democrats actually showed a significant decrease in searches for cars and houses after the election in 2017 versus in 2016. So this the assumption there is that, or the conclusion there is that it really is motivated reasoning. These sharp divergences in consumer confidence on surveys are based on people's real economic beliefs.
I have one last question before we go. So there's been a lot of debate, at least in the news, I'm not so sure among academics, about Republican versus Democratic enthusiasm for the upcoming election.
Mm-hmm.
And, there's sort of commentators talking about a blue wave, and then Trump is saying something about a red wave. That seems to have come and gone, but who knows? Is there anything in that you know about in this search data that would tell you something about likely voter turnout or enthusiasm for the election?
So I've not looked at that, but I know that Seth Stevens-Davidovitz, who uses Google Trends data, has found that searches for, voter, voting does tend to correlate with turnout. I have not, I haven't done the data analysis myself. Could do it this afternoon if I so chose, but I don't know. But that's a great question.
Mm-hmm. Actually, there's one more from the audience. We have another minute. This is not a question, but rather a suggestion for evaluating relative importance of factors. The work of Ulrike Grumping, I'm probably mispronouncing that, reviews the many metrics that have been used to address this issue. There's an R module, RELAMPO, that summarizes the approach. And then this is a question from Thomas Ball. He links a link to that as well. So I can, Masha, I can send you that link.
Yeah, that would be fantastic.
Yep. Okay. Well, we're just about out of time, so I'm going to go ahead and thank Masha for being our presenter this week. I want to note that the presentation will be posted to our website shortly after this broadcast if you'd like to share it with a colleague or watch it again later. I also want to advertise a talk on November 2nd. That's 2 weeks from now. When we will host a roundtable discussion of gender citations in the methods community, featuring Michelle Dion from McMaster, Sarah Mitchell from the University of Iowa, Dave Peterson from Iowa State, so I'll have to rein them in from discussing the relative merits of Iowa and Iowa State, I guess, and Barbara Walter from UCSD. Please check out our website, www.methods-colloquium.com, to get more information about this talk. Masha, thanks very much for giving a great talk today.
Thank you for having me.
And I hope to see everyone 2 weeks from now.